So I want to introduce myself first. My name is Susan Scott. I'm a Lutheran pastor, and I work at Stanford Hospital as the decedent care chaplain. And I always love to tell the story that when I first started there 6 years ago this month, right about this time, there was one social worker who would always look at the word decedent, and instead of decedent want to say decadent. And so it made for a good story. And then there were other people say, is that descendant chaplain? And so it made for a good story in terms of, what I do. Basically, my job, I mostly work with the families who've had a death at Stanford. I help them to know what they need to do in terms of funeral homes. One of the important things that for some people is important is to be able to just slow down. And then I also, for other people, because of their tradition, they need to do a very fast burial. And so for those people, we speed up and we make sure we get the death certificate done right away, and we get the process moved along, and we call the funeral home that they want. And we do whatever we can to help make it happen the way the family would want. So this afternoon, what we're going to talk primarily about is grief and loss, a little bit about spirituality, but I know my colleague, Lori Klein, is coming next week and the week after, and so she'll be talking about some other things in the area of spirituality. So I'm going to focus mostly on grief and loss, dealing with grief, how wide I think grief is, that there's, when we think grief and loss, we think often of someone dies and we're grieving that loss, but grief happens in a lot of other ways, and so I want to talk about that. The tasks that are ours when we are grieving and what we can expect when we're grieving. And then maybe you have a friend or someone who is in the midst of grieving and you want to be of help to them. So we'll touch on that a little bit. And then a little bit, as I said, on spirituality and how that helps us when we are going through our own kind of grief. I want to let you know that I think learning how to grieve is a good skill to have. And not that I want bad things to happen to anybody. I don't want that to happen. But people who can grieve and have some kind of sort of spiritual foundation which can hold them during their time of grief, they can also thrive in life. And they can get better. And that doesn't mean they're not going to cry. That doesn't mean they're not going to have bad days, but they somehow get through better. And they are able to move on. A few months ago, I was with a woman at a cemetery, and her child had died as a baby over 50 years ago. And she stood at the grave and recounted a story about something her husband had done at the time the child died that she was still mad about. And it just feels to me, it feels very sad to me, because it feels like she has not been able to let it go and move on. And she is really the only one being hurt by it now. She is holding that grievance and holding onto it tight and telling it to everyone who she can tell it to, and it's only hurting herself. So one of our tasks is to move through grief and to place who that person was and the things that happened in a different place in our lives. This book is called Fine Black Lines. It is written by a woman who had breast cancer. And so whenever we have an accident or we have a disease, we also grieve that. And I like that she has some simple little writings, and I like some of them. And so I want to start with one of them, which she calls The Gift. And what she's calling a gift is the fact that she got breast cancer. So, it is a gift, this reminder of mortality, this thing that slows me down, this reflective summer. I know things about myself I could not otherwise have known. Pain can be endured. Uncertainty can be tolerated. Loss can be processed. I know there is a wellspring of strength, courage, joy within me. I know that time is not forever. There is an urgency, a poignancy, a preciousness to life. I know that I do not fear suffering or death as much anymore. It is a menace. It is a sorrow. It is a loss of innocence. It is a gift. And that is one of the ways she wrote about the breast cancer that she had. And I have a couple other ones I will share with you. So think for a moment of a 2-year-old is playing with a toy, and another 2-year-old comes up and takes that toy away. What is the first 2-year-old doing? Yeah, and often they'll be crying, won't they? And I think that at a very basic level, that is also like an immediate grief response. They've lost something. And so when things happen to us, we grieve over all kinds of things. When I was in high school, for the 9th and 10th grade, my father was in the Army, so we moved all over the place. 9th and 10th grade, we lived in Verdun, France. And we went to a high school that did not have lockers for PE. And I had a very favorite birthstone ring. And PE time would come, and I'd have to take it off, and I would hang it on the little hook with all my clothes, and one day it was gone. And I searched, and I searched, and I searched, and I searched for it. And then finally, I just, it's gone. I'm never going to get it back. That was grieving for that, because it was something that was special to me. My parents had given it to me, and I didn't have it anymore. That was a thing of grief. Several years ago, well, longer now, but I broke my arm. I fell crossing the street by my church and had to have surgery. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I've never had to have surgery before. What does this mean? And then all of a sudden I realized how much I use my left arm. And it was a form of grieving the use of this arm, of having to think about, do I just get my hair cut off because I'm not going to be able to dry my hair the way I used to? What are the things I need to do to be able to move forward because of this broken arm? So those are, those kinds of things happen to us, and we grieve. We grieve those things. The end of a relationship. Maybe somebody was your friend, and all of a sudden they're not your friend. You grieve that. A natural disaster. In this area, the fire in Belmont. Surely, with the people who lost their homes, they grieved that. Or if there's a forest fire and you lose your home, you grieve that. So it's not just when someone dies. There are all kinds of things that happen in our lives that bring up that grief and loss. And so I want to go over with you a piece that's been helpful to me. It's called, it comes from a book called All Our Losses, All Our Griefs, which is it's a very Christian book, but I think this section of it is kind of a helpful piece. And it's helpful to understand sort of the kinds of things that we face when we grieve, and the kinds of things that can happen to us when we're grieving. And so that we have that experience of what's going on with me right now, and we realize, oh, I'm grieving. This happened, and I feel sad. I wish this hadn't happened to me. So these authors have split grief out into 6 types of loss. And I think that you can probably come up with a lot more examples than I have here. But there is material loss, is the first one that they talk about. And that would be like losing my ring, or having a car accident and your favorite car is now totaled. It's the loss of something physical. It can also be the loss of physical surroundings. I mentioned that when I was in 9th and 10th grade, I lived in France. People ask me, where are you from? And I don't always know how to answer that, because my father was in the Army. So I was born in San Francisco. A year later, my sister was born in Arizona. a year and a half later after that, or 2 years later, my brother was born in Sacramento, then we lived in Okinawa, and then we lived in Sacramento, and then we lived in France, and then we lived in Italy, and then we lived in San Francisco in 4 different places. And so I was always having to start over. Every September was a new school. And I just didn't know anything else. But in retrospect, I think, we had to say goodbye all the time, and we had to start over all the time. And so that was and it was a new place and new surroundings and trying to make new friends. And when you're in kindergarten, you don't develop friends who are going to write you letters and that you're going to be able to keep. And so that was kind of part of my life that in looking back, there was some grieving that went on each of those times we had to do that moving. So material loss can be the loss of your purse when you're searching for it. It can be the loss of a wallet, an article of clothing. It can be moving from, a lot of people when they retire or after they've retired, they move from a big house to a smaller house, and they have to get rid of a lot of things, or they're going to have a house that just has barely little paths to get through, and that's a material loss. When I was a chaplain in the state of Washington, we helped a woman who was living in a skilled nursing facility. We went to her house because the house was going to be sold. She wanted her family to take all of her things because they were so special to her. They didn't want them. They had all their own things. And so we went to her house, and she would go over the things, and she would talk about when she got it and where she got it and what it meant to her and her life with her husband in that house. And then eventually those things had to be sold, and they went to strangers. And it was hard for her. That's a material loss, because we connect meaning to we often connect meaning to our material things. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a TV show called Buried Alive or Hoarders. Most of those people in that show, these are extreme cases of people who have not been able to, who need to let go of some stuff and not been able to. But in almost every case, there's some unresolved grief that they have not been able to work through, and so they start collecting stuff and hold on to stuff. And it's just very painful for them to even think about letting go of. And they live in a place where there's barely a path, or some are walking on 3 feet of stuff that's collected because it's too painful to let it go. And so there's usually some kind of grief, unresolved grief that's part of that, because they have not been able to. So that's material loss. The second one that they list is relationship loss. The idea of, you're used to, say, sitting at coffee in the morning with the person, or maybe it was a friend that you met for coffee somewhere and something happens to them. That's a relationship loss. You sat with them. If you lose a spouse and you always sat and had breakfast together, or you had your meals together, or you looked forward to coming home at the end of the day and say, this is what happened to me, and you don't have that anymore, that's a relationship loss. It also sometimes, when we lose someone in the relationship, there's not a chance to settle it, to settle the issues. Some things get left undone. And so we grieve that also. We may have some regrets about things we said, or things we didn't say, or things we wished we had said. Loss of neighbors. And so again, if you think about people who anticipate being retired or anticipate living in a retirement community, if they've lived in a house, some people have lived in a house for 40 years. The longest I've ever lived in one place was 8 years. And that was in my whole life, the longest I ever lived in one place was 8 years. And that's the last place I lived in, over in the East Bay. But some people have lived in a house for 40 years, 50 years, their whole married life. And now they're asked to move someplace else because they need assistance, that they miss their neighbors, they miss their newspaper boy or newspaper girl, all of those relationships get changed. There's a woman at my church who had her, I think, 97th birthday or something last year. And, you know, we could tell she's not doing very well at home. She's not able to manage things, and different people from the church would stop in. Her only relative is her son who lives in Florida. And I think he was wise in this. He'd say, I know she should come and live with me, but that would cut her off from all her friends. It would cut her off from all her relationships. And she may die if she loses all of that. And so I don't want to make her do anything she doesn't want to do. And so she continued to live in her house until she decided, okay, now I think I need to do this. And she finally moved with her son to Florida. So, yes. The third one is an intra-psychic loss. And so it's a loss of how we imagine ourselves. And we can have this loss if a parent loses a child and they're not a parent anymore. That's how they think of themselves. It can also be the loss of future dreams. If you had dreams of what you were going to be doing and then something happens that precludes all of those from happening, that would be this intrapsychic loss. You had dreams that are never going to happen. The what might have beens, those kinds of things, the possibilities. An illness that prevents from fulfilling your dreams. Sometimes we hear the story of someone retired and they made all these plans. They were going to do all kinds of travel. And then one of the partners gets sick and they can't do that travel. They can't do those things that they had planned. And so that's a loss of this intrapsychic loss. Then the fourth one is the functional loss. So I think most of us, as we age, we begin to experience that. I mentioned when I broke my arm, there was a functional loss there. I fell in the park. No, I fell at a friend's house 3 years ago. And I was okay. I thought I was okay at first. And then all of a sudden, my knee just sort of gave out on me, and I went to the emergency department, and they put this brace on my leg, and then they said, here. They gave me a cane. And I went, oh, no. But they go, oh, yes, we want you to take this cane and use this. And I had to sort of swallow my pride a little bit and go, okay, this is what I need to do now. And then a couple of months after that, they finally did an MRI to see what was going on. And they went, oh my gosh, your other knee is having a problem. You can't put any weight on it. And so I had to be in a wheelchair for like 3 months because I couldn't do the crutches. My arms were not strong enough to do crutches. So I was in this wheelchair, and it just was like, oh my gosh, your life is so different. You see things differently. You have to have time to get out of the wheelchair, get the wheelchair into the car, hop along on one foot so you can do all that. All of those things are functional loss. And as we age, we experience those kinds of losses. The fifth one is role loss. And so that could be sort of what you're accustomed to. And again, using the example of the death of a spouse, you were used to being a couple, and now you're not a couple anymore. You were used to, when my father retired, he retired at age 60. He worked for the state, and they did this Golden Glove thing, and so he retired at age 60. And I don't know in my life if I've ever seen him so sad as the day he retired. And it was totally unexpected on my part, because for months prior to the retirement, he was talking about, he goes, I'm going to retire. Oh, it's going to be great. I'm going to retire. They're going to have a lunch for me. They're going to have a limousine for me. And they had the lunch and they had the limousine, and then he went home. And it was like, okay, now what do I do? And he and I went to this was 20-some years ago. So he and I went to the store to get the pictures developed, which we don't do anymore, but we went to get the pictures developed, and we were walking around waiting for the pictures. And I remember saying, "You seem kind of sad." He goes, "Well, yeah, it is kind of sad. I don't, what am I going to do now?" And for years, every year, for years and years and years, he would get up in the morning and he'd go to work. And now the next morning, he wasn't going to be doing that. And he wasn't going to be the manager of this computer room anymore. And what was he going to do? Now, bless his heart, my father figured this out. And he has become a great volunteer, which he never volunteered anywhere before then. And he started off volunteering at a museum, and then he volunteered at our church, and then he's a Shriner, so he became a volunteer at the Shriners Hospital, and he drives vans to take children to and from the hospital. And so he really, he joined the SIRS group, and so he really found a new niche for himself. But that day when he retired and the festivities were over, it was a sad day. And that would be an example of role loss. And then the last one is systemic loss. And so that is really the loss to a group. At my church, the example I use on this is, at my church there was a woman named Janet, and she had sort of taken on this role of finding the cartoons or the jokes in papers and magazines that said something about God. And she would cut them out, and there was a special bulletin board that Janet managed. And it was always Janet who managed that. And then Janet died. And the bulletin board was just there. And then the cartoons started sort of curling up on the ends because they got old. And finally the bulletin board came down. And it was a loss to our system that Janet had died. Now, when a person dies, you can have all of these things happen. So if someone loses their spouse, there can be a material loss because they've lost the income, or they've lost part of the money that's been coming in, or they also may have to move, may not be able to stay in the same place. So there's material loss when you lose a spouse. Clearly there's a relationship loss when you lose a spouse, because that's the person you always did everything with, and that person's not there anymore. There's an all of this plays in. There's an intrapsychic loss because you had hopes and dreams for what the two of you would do together, and that's not going to happen anymore. And you may or may not have a functional loss. One of the things about us when we're grieving is we actually can be more prone to accidents. So we need to be more careful, especially in the heaviest time of the grieving. A friend of mine, her husband died, and she rode horses. And a few months after he died, she was out riding a horse, and the horse fell on her, and she was okay. But that I do think there was some connection to the fact that she was grieving, and that this accident happened in that time. The role loss of not being a couple, not being able to do the things that you did before. Using my mother takes care of my father. I mean, she probably knows more about what is the right diet for him than what is the right diet for her. She knows what medicines he needs to take and when he needs to take them, and she's always reminding. Now, she also has her own medicines, and she also has to do her own blood checks and stuff. And if she forgets her own, oh well. But she always reminds my dad, "Did you take your medicine, Harry? You better make sure you take your medicine. Harry, you're not supposed to eat that." If my father dies before my mother, it's going to be a huge loss for her, because she manages all those things about his life and takes care of all those things. That's her day-to-day thing. That's her role, that she just really does all the time. And to lose that will be a big thing for her. And then the systemic loss. So the loss to the system, the loss of the role that that person played. An example that I heard was a family with, I think there were 3 children, and the dad was a truck driver, and the mom. But the dad was kind of the one that the family centered around. And something happened, and he died. And the mother just had no clue what to do. She was just lost. And the children were just kind of not knowing what to do at all. They were young. And there was a grief counselor who went to see them. And the thing she did, one of the things she did with them was she took this clay pot, like a flower pot, and she took to the little one, gave it to one of the little boys, and she said, now throw it on the ground. And he said, throw it on the ground? It's going to break. And she goes, exactly. I want you to do that. And so he threw it on the ground. It broke into 4 or 5 pieces. And she said, this is what's happened to your family. And then as they sat around the table, she helped them glue that flower pot back together and helped them to learn it would never be the same again, but they would be able to come back together in some fashion. And so that glued together pot reminded them of how they needed to sort of stick together and find new ways of being with each other because they had lost the one that they had all circled around. So does this make sense in terms of this types of loss and how, you know, some little thing may just trip us, and then when we have the loss of a loved one by death, all of these things become part of what's going on. Does that, any questions about this or comments? Because maybe I'm sure that you've had experiences.
The physiological part of having a loss of grieving.
I wasn't necessarily going into too much. What do you want? What do you want?
I've said to people I have a broken heart, and they said, "Does it really hurt?" And I said, "Haven't you ever had a broken heart about something?" And they said, "No, I've never had that physiological pain."
I mean, my experience was like a big hole. And just this big hole that was just hurt all the time. And so what I usually say to people is, I mean, physiologically, as much as you can, do some exercise, as much as you can, eat well, as much as you can, try to make sure you get some sleep, as much as you can do those good things for yourself that will help you in the midst of that. And then in the midst of that, you also need to be talking to people and, you know, who are the people that are helpful. Some people are not helpful. When I was in seminary, I lost a very dear friend of mine. It was one of those phone calls where I got the phone call that she had died, and the person went on to talk about what had happened, and in my mind I thought, I'm going to have to ask her who she's talking about, because she couldn't be talking about, you know, it just never could happen to, her name was Betty Ann. It couldn't happen to Betty Ann. But then I realized it was, and I'm a person who needs to sort of talk out things and find safe people to talk out with. And so I had this good friend at seminary, and we were going to have dinner, and he was not the one. You know, he could not listen to my sadness. He could not sit there. He wanted to make it better. So he was not the one. So, I mean, I think people who are grieving need to find the people who can sit there with you and hold it with you and hold the pain and be there with you and let you cry and let you do what you need. Because I'm also very convinced that when we have people like that who can sit with us and we can cry and we feel better. And it may be a short while that we feel better, but we that's part of the healing, to be able to let it all out. Yes.
I'd like to go back to the physiological question,
Yes.
because it sparks the memory. A week after my mother died, my father had an emergency triple bypass. You know, think of dying broken heart. I actually have a friend whose father did die of a heart attack 4 weeks after the mother died. And could you talk about what's happening, about dying, what sort of physiological? Is this just coincident? These just coincidental
No, it's not.
situations?
It's clearly not. I mean, especially when you have a couple that has been married, they've been married, especially couples that have been married like 60 some years. This is true. I went to the dentist in to have a new crown, and they, when they do the crown, they drill it all down, and you're there for quite a while, and then you come back 2 weeks later. And the day I was there getting it all drilled down, my dentist's mother was in the hospital, and she had fallen. And she was the primary caregiver for his father. And so she was in the hospital, and he said, I don't think she's going to make it. I think she's probably going to die. 2 weeks later, I went in again to the dentist, and who I am, there with my mouth, I go, and by the way, how's your mother, or what happened with your mother? And he said, oh, how long since you've been here? His mother died, and 4 or 5 days later, his father died. They had been married like 60 years. And the really sweet part of that story was his father he'd always talk about, I'm going to go take the bus here or take the bus there. And his father was in bed, and they said, Dad, go ahead, get on the bus. Mom's waiting for you. But it was just a few days. I used to work at the Masonic Home in Union City, which is a retirement center. And often that would happen there is if they had been married more than 60 years, if one died, the other one would die shortly thereafter. It's just so much part of their life. Sometimes one has been hanging on to take care of the other, and once they're not needing to take care of the other, their own health issues sort of percolate a little more. So, yes, go ahead.
I may not be able to get this out, so I'll work
just
my
get it
way
out
till
any way you want.
Figure out what I'm trying to ask. I guess it goes to the subject of how does one honor the way other people appear to want to grieve or not. And the example I would give is one of my sons lost a baby boy. And the couple, he and his wife, just turned in and away from everybody. And my son and I are very close. And so I've got these layers of almost feeling like I've been disallowed to grieve with them, but there's also this thing about they get to grieve their own way, but I have trouble, I guess, honoring that because, there's no discussion about it. It's not a topic to be on the table at all. And
So they don't talk about the baby at all?
And you may not go there with them. And so it's a struggle for me. And so I guess the question is, how does one honor somebody else's?
I think it's a very hard thing, and if I were to think about what, maybe what I think I would have to find the people that I could talk about my grief. And it seems like your grief then is compounded by the fact that you've been cut off by them. So you grieve that also. The relationship you had with your son and possibly your daughter-in-law isn't there anymore. So who are the people that you could reach out to for your grief? And then what are the ways that you could in some way remain connected to them So if the time comes when they do need to open up, you might be available to them. But yeah, you have to honor it. Everybody has their own way, and I don't think it would get you anywhere if you tried to tell them they weren't grieving correctly. You know, we each kind of do our own thing. Now, there are people who, in their grief or in their loss, they sort of create a story that they tell over and over and over and over, and because of the way they tell the same thing over and over, you can tell they're not getting better. And so we don't necessarily help them by listening over and over to their story, but that's, you know, more few and far between. I think people need to be listened to and to be able to tell what's going on. So on the physiological one that which was your question. So, I mean, I think the basic things are trying to do the best you can to take care of yourself so that you minimize the physiological things. Some people do need to have, you know, have some help. A temporary period of time may need some help with some medicine. My colleague, before I was a chaplain, I worked as a parish pastor, and my colleague suddenly died. And in my lifetime, you know, that is certainly one of the biggest losses I ever had. And it was compounded by the fact that then I was like the pastor who was left in the congregation, and the whole congregation was grieving. And when I went to my doctor, I became ill that week. I mean, I had no voice. I had this really bad cold because there just wasn't. I lost weight during that week, which I never lose weight. So, and all of those things happened because I wasn't able to eat. And my doctor, he prescribed some Ativan for me because he said, if I lost my colleague, this is what I would need. And I said, no, I don't. You know, I'm kind of a person who, no. But I remember just being so tired and so kind of worn out, and wanting to try to be helpful to my colleague's widow, and there were 4 young children, and wanting to be helpful to the members of the congregation and I was just so tired. And so one night I thought, well, maybe I should try this Ativan. And the apartment I lived in had an upstairs and a downstairs, and I was in the living room and the television was on, and I took this Ativan, and which I had never in my life taken, and I woke up the next morning still fully dressed in my bed upstairs. The door had not been locked at the apartment. The television was still on, and I went, okay, I need to do this differently. And so, but Ativan actually gave me a good night's sleep, which helped me then for the next day and helped me for a few days after that. And so I actually wound up using more of it, but I would lock everything up, turn off the TV, get into my pajamas, get into bed, and then take the Ativan, and really did feel much more refreshed the next morning and, you know, back to what I needed to be doing. So sometimes people do need something that would help them that way. You don't want to use alcohol. You don't want to use things that are harmful for you. And those are other kinds of things that people try to mention. Okay. I am going to I have a handout also about expectations for your grief, your time of grief. So things that you can expect. Different people have these different stages of grief. And so you probably have heard of Kubler-Ross and her stages of grief. And the only thing I want to say about that is the mistake people make is they think that, okay, you start with denial and then you move to anger and then you move to this and then you move to this and then you move to finally to acceptance and then it's over. No, it doesn't go that way. You can revert back and you can move forward and then you can find yourself back again, and it's just kind of sometimes like a roller coaster. Sometimes you can think, okay, I finally feel like I've made some progress. I had a good day, and the next day is crappy. But what you have to hold on to is that you did have the good day, and that is a sign that you are moving forward. Sometimes we need to just kind of escape it. And I remember in the midst of this whole thing in my congregation and just feeling so sad and just this, just so sad all the time. And I went to a meeting, it was a dinner meeting, and I thought, okay, none of these people at this meeting know what happened. I can just escape from anything about the loss. I can just pretend that it didn't happen. I'm going to order my favorite thing on the menu, which is shrimp, and then we will go from there. The waiter brings my plate of shrimp in front of me, and this woman across the table says, "Oh, Susan, I don't think the others around the table know what happened." I just lost my appetite. I just couldn't eat anymore. And, so I think it's okay to try to escape once in a while, but you got to find someone who will escape with you and not make you face the things that are going on, And then I had this other friend that something would happen, and this was a very complicated situation, but something would happen and I'd be so upset and crying. And his name was Peter, and I would call him, and Peter would come over with 2 Diet Cokes. And I would tell him what had happened that day, and I would cry and cry and cry and cry and cry and cry, and we would talk and talk, and finally I would realize I had laughed about something. And I thought, okay, I have moved through whatever this one was, and Peter had helped me through it. And we would just sit there, and he would just listen, and we would, move on. He didn't try to make it better. He didn't try to philosophize. And I think that for me, the people that you really want to stay away from are the people who are trying to make it better for you. Look on the bright side. Oh my gosh, don't do that to me. You didn't see her. She was ready to shoot them right over here. Or, people sometimes say, well, this is one of my least favorite. God must have wanted another flower in heaven. Now, if a man dies and it's his wife who's saying God must have wanted another flower in heaven, bless her heart. That helps her. Bless her heart. It doesn't help me. What helps me is, and I'll tell you some other things later, but what helps me is to think that God is with me, and that's a big part of my spirituality. And so I think what helps people is their spirituality, whatever it is, whatever your sort of ground framework is, that will help you through. So instead of looking at stages, which you sort of go back and forth through, one author that I was looking at talks about 3 kind of stages, but it's only 3, where others have a whole bunch of stages. And these are, the first one is the impact. And so the impact is that initial shock that the loss has occurred. And the second one is to recoil. And that is when you realize that the loss is irrevocable. And the emotions begin to stir up, and the sadness comes, and the anger comes, and those things come. And then the third stage that he mentions is accommodation, when you finally begin adjusting to the loss. So for a couple minutes, let's think about a loss that you've had. and probably, preferably one that you may have had some chance to work through before this point. And think about how you responded when you first heard about the loss. Now, I will tell you how I responded. You know those Rolodex things that they kind of spin around? I was at my colleague's house. His wife and I were going to go shopping. He was out riding his bicycle. He had not come home, so she went out to look for him. She said, you know, he's not very mechanical. He's probably had a flat tire somewhere and he can't get here. So I was at the house with the 3 small children, and the coroner came to the door. In my head, it was like a spinning Rolodex. And I was searching in my head for what is the reason these men are at this door that is not that something bad has happened to him. That was my room. And I told you my other one was, I must have heard wrong. It couldn't be. So do you have any things that you remember from when you had a loss and that first impact? Yes.
I remember something like 3 days. I was numb, for lack of a better word. And I remember the importance of routine for me. And I had a place to go like 3 days later. And I was telling myself, you know, this is a pretty important time. Something pretty major has happened to you. It doesn't make sense for you to go to that routine kind of whatever. But somehow I was just driven to go to that. And I went there and I didn't say anything. Nobody knew what had happened. And I just went through the
motion.
Yeah, and I mean, generally I'm a participant. I didn't participate, but there was something about I had to go and be there.
Anyone else in terms of the impact? Yes. I think I had one as a student nurse.
As a student nurse?
As a student nurse, where we were in surgery and the physician had cut off somebody's leg. Oh. And he handed it to me thinking that I was the regular staff. And said, back it and send it to Pat. And I just totally lost it. I fell right into the surgical, you know, field. And I was able to recoup myself. And he said, oh, you know, are you okay? Did you have a nice trip? And I said, yeah. Did you get my postcard? You know, and I mean, it was amazing holding someone's leg. And I'm sorry to have a reaction about it right now. It was just so powerful. And I don't think I really accepted or realized the power of how intense grief can really be. Oh my God, that was 30 years ago. And it's just being triggered with this discussion here today. Amazing. Amazing.
And you know, we do revisit our griefs. When I was in training to be a chaplain, I was with a family whose baby had died, and the baby was only about a week old and had had heart surgery. And I had been with other families, you know, but not right at the time of the death. And I think I was really struck by this one because the nurses were working on this baby, the nurses and the doctors were working on this baby, and they had said to me, if you're going to baptize this baby, you do it now because this baby is dying. And so I'm this fairly new chaplain, and I'm doing my thing of baptizing this baby. And in our tradition, we would say the Lord's Prayer as part of the baptism. And so I started saying the Lord's Prayer, and even the doctors and nurses were saying the Lord's Prayer with me because they were, a part of all this. Well, then the nurses, after the baby died, the parents and I went into this little room, and then finally the nurses brought the baby's body in, and he was in a basket. And the mother held him for a while, the grandmother held him for a while, then they put him back in the basket, and they were talking to each other, and I was still in the room with them, and I was looking at the baby in the basket, and suddenly I wasn't Susan the chaplain looking at a baby in a basket. I was Susan the 9-year-old looking at her brother in a coffin, and I was right back to my brother's funeral, and I realized, oh my gosh, and I had hardly remembered. I mean, I'd remembered certain things about my brother's funeral, but that just brought that right back to me. And so part of when you're training to be a chaplain, you have a supervisor, and part of it, I had to go then and talk with my supervisor and say, clearly, the 9-year-old hasn't done all her work on this particular death. And I couldn't do anything right then, but the next time I met with my supervisor, I said, I need to talk about this and what happened, and revisit it again as an adult, because I hadn't moved on as much. So then the third one is accommodation, to begin to adjust to the loss. And I'm going to be talking too much and run out of time. So I want to show you this other set of tasks, because I actually find this idea of what are the tasks that we need to do more helpful than what are the stages that we need to go through. The stages are kind of, they kind of come and go, and I think there's value in them, but to think about, what are the things that I need to do when I'm facing this loss, I think is a helpful piece. And the first task that we need to do is to accept the reality of the loss. And I think that we have the possibility of sort of going back and forth into, well, maybe it's not really true, or finding ourselves yearning for something that can't be. And so the story I have about this in myself is this relates to this picture. This is, some of you may have heard of Mary Engelbreit. So this is a picture that is one of her pictures, and she calls it "Don't Look Back." I have a different name for this picture. But I was in the midst of grief, and I saw this picture, and what you can't see from your seats is that there's this road, and there's a fork in the road. And at the fork in the road, there's a road sign. And so to the left, it says "Your life." And to the right, it says "No longer an option." And the first time that I saw this picture, I was so struck by, that's right, I am yearning for something that is no longer an option. What do I need to do to choose life? And so that's what I call this picture. It's my choose life picture. And I was still working at the church at the time, and I went back and I told people, and I had gone shopping one day in Sacramento, and I went back and I said, you know that picture I told you about? They have a watch with that picture on it. I saw it in a store today. Isn't that amazing? Well, two of my friends drove from Fairfield to Sacramento one night after work and gave me the watch that I've had now for 20 years that reminds me to choose life. What is it that is life-giving? And so I actually have one of these in my house, this picture in my house, and it is just a very good way for me to think about when I've experienced a loss, am I catching myself yearning for something that can't be? And how can I refocus myself, turn myself to something that will be life-giving and will be good for me? Because to stand there and yearn for something is not going to get you anywhere. This relates to this experience of my colleague pastor dying, and I was going through some cards and things that people had sent me, and it was like 15 years later. Had been a long time, and I was sort of sorting through, and all of a sudden the person who was helping me sort through, I said, I can't do any more of this right now. I have to stop, because it just was too painful. So I had to stop and put it away, and then another day I could do some more, you know. So this is helpful to me to think about what is choosing life. That for me was a moment when I really did accept the reality of the loss, that this was not going to come back. He was not going to come back. We were not going to have the collegial relationship that we had. His children were not going to have their dad, and this was real. The second task is to work through to the pain of the grief. And people will do that in different ways. Some people talk about the pain coming on like a wave at the ocean, that if you've ever been at the ocean, all of a sudden this wave just sort of comes out of nowhere. And they will speak about that, and our tendency would be want to run from it. But really, it's sort of counterintuitive, but the more healthy way or the more healing way is to let it wash over us and let us feel that pain, and then let us go on. That is the way that is more healthy. And so that's another of the tasks, is to work through that pain, to work through things so that they're not as painful anymore, and to move forward. The third task is to adjust to environment in which the deceased is missing. And if you've lost someone and you go someplace where they were already there, I think it's actually possible to think you see them. You know, to think you see them there. And then you go, oh, that's because I'm wishing he were here, or I'm wishing she was here. And that's because we sort of look for them. It's so painful to us that they're gone, that in our minds or in our psyche, we're looking for them. And they're not there anymore. And so we need to adjust to a world in which they don't exist anymore. And then to also then emotionally relocate them. So that is the place where the memories become good memories, and we're not as hurt by the memories. And we can talk about the memories, and we can talk about the good things and the funny things and the sad things, and it doesn't hurt us so much. And we have moved them to a new place. So I have a couple of more handouts, and we have about 10 minutes. Is that right? Okay. So this one, I'm not going to say too much. This is one about expectations for your time of grief. And the first one is, I think the one that I always like to emphasize, is that your grief will take longer than most people think. So don't let people tell you you should be done if you still need work to do. And you know, and then you have those other people who you've had a loss, and they'll say, I know exactly how you feel. They don't. They don't. Even if they've had a very similar loss, they don't know how you feel. Because they're not you. The number 2 is your grief will take more energy than you ever imagined, and you'll be tired while you're grieving. And your grief will show itself in all spheres of your life. I think what I like about this particular sheet is that sometimes people who are grieving get discouraged. And this can say to you, oh yeah, it is going to take a long time. Oh yeah, I am going to have some identity confusion about this. Oh yeah, this makes sense. This is what I'm going through. So I think this is one to, like number 16, you may feel like you're going crazy. Oh yeah, that's a thing that you can be expected. And so this kind of brings you back to, oh yeah, this is hard work. And that's why I like that one. And then the next one is one for you in terms of if you are being the helper for someone else who's grieving. Now, a lot of times people will say, if you need anything, call me. People who are grieving don't necessarily know what they need. My friend whose husband died, she had another friend come over, and this friend was telling her about everything happens for a reason, and you'll be fine, and da 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 da. And I couldn't stand it anymore, and I said, why don't we go for a walk? And so we left her house, and we went outside for a walk and left that friend at the house. So sometimes we have to be the one, if we're helping someone, we have to be the one to go and say, how about this? How about if, I come over and we just sit, or we just have a cup of coffee? Or how about if I go to Pete's and get a couple of things of coffee or a couple of things of tea, and I just come and you and I drink that tea? You don't want to make work for them, the one who's grieving. You don't want to make work for them, but you want to be available and be connected to them. And the second one also, to be a good listener. So if you're the one being helpful, and the person who's grieving says, I've had a terrible day today, you don't want to respond to that by saying, so have I. I've had a really terrible day. That doesn't help anything. If you're going to be the one to help, then you need to just listen and make it about them and about that person, the person who's grieving, and save your terrible day to go tell somebody else who can help you. Just stick with it. I was talking to someone Friday at the hospital was a bad day. I mean, they were even talking about they had never had such a day at the hospital. And so then I was talking to someone later in the evening, and he said, well, how's it going down there? And because he doesn't live in this area. And I said, oh, it was a hard day today. And he goes, oh, I know what you mean. It was a hard day for me too. And he just went off into his thing, and I didn't get a chance to say anything about my day being hard. So when we are wanting to help someone, we want to be the listener. We want to be the one to let them talk. And we can share, but we don't want to make it about us. We want to make it about them, because that will help them to heal. And once in a while we can say, this is what helped me. It may or may not help you. I don't know. And so we can share some things, but we do want to focus on them. So a few minutes about spirituality. We unfortunately live in a nation that seems to prize youth. And we sort of think that after a certain age, you don't count anymore, or you're not valuable anymore. And I watched on Saturday night, I visited my parents' house, and I watched the 90th birthday of Betty White, which was kind of a fun kind of thing to see her being praised. But after the show, there was this TV show that wasn't very good. She was in it, called Off Their Rockers, which I guess was canceled because it's not very good. But but I watched it, and there was just something about it that I liked. And I think the thing that I liked about it was that it was elders are not just old people who don't do anything anymore. And these were sort of crazy old people, but they were not just sitting in knitting or sitting in rocking in a rocking chair. They were doing funny things, and I think partly that was a point of it that I sort of liked, that that we don't have to have these stereotypes of how you have to be when you get to a certain age. You can be who you can be. In my bedroom, I have this picture where I'm in it with my aunt and uncle and my parents and my sister and my grandparents. And I'm 3 years old in the picture. Well, I currently am older than anybody in that picture. But it's hard for me to imagine that I'm older than my grandparents. I mean, but I am. I mean, in that picture, they were in their 50s, and so I'm older than they were, and so that's just kind of how do you define yourself, and how do you think about what's important to you, and so I have this last handout, and then I want to talk a little bit about the spirituality as being sort of a foundation for us as we experience losses, and as we age, we'll experience more losses because we will lose friends, we will lose partners, we may lose our work, our identities, all of those things that we lose. Our spirituality helps us get through, and so it's the way that we think about life, and when I say spirituality, I don't mean religion, because religion is more like an organized spirituality. And so religion can help your spirituality, but you don't have to be religious to be spiritual. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, there were two writers, John Rowe and Robert Kahn, that I was looking at, and they talked about 3 pillars to success, what they called successful aging. And one was avoiding disease and disability. And some of us are much better, have better genes, and we can do that better than others. Some of us will have to deal with disease and disability. A second one is active engagement in life. And a third one is maximizing your cognitive and physical fitness. I don't know if you've seen, there's this app for iPhones and iPads called Luminosity. Have somebody say, oh yes? Yes. And it's the idea of it is it works your brain and helps your brain to be nimble, and it has you look at this and do different things, and oops. Okay, and so you have to do these different things, and then the idea is it keeps your brain functioning and functioning well. And so then they talked about one of the things, said there really is a 4th pillar, and the 4th pillar is spirituality. And I would actually think that spirituality sort of pulls the 3 pillars together, and it helps all 3, that it's not a separate 4th pillar, but somehow it combines the 3 and has them all work together. And so let me just, I have this one last sheet for you, but I know I'm out of time. So what I'm gonna pass it around, but I want you to sort of think about your own spirituality and think of it in this way: is what is strength for you? Where do you find strength? And where do you go, or who do you go to get it? What is peace for you? Where do you find it? And what is security for you? Where do you find it? And I thought about it for me and what it means for me. And where's my page here? And so a couple examples of places where I find strength and peace and security are in Scripture. And there's a verse in Lamentations 3 in what I call the Old Testament, where it says, "The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies are new every morning. They never come to an end. That is something that helps me in the midst of just a horrible day. And sometimes I'm with this family and then that family who had a sudden loss. In the midst of that, this helps ground me to think of these words. But the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Another one that helps me is from the Psalms, Psalm 27. One thing I ask of the Lord, one thing will I seek, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. And that idea of just one thing, not a huge amount, just one thing, that helps me to feel grounded. And then Julian of Norwich has a prayer in which she ends with, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. And that doesn't mean they're going to be perfect and happy and happily ever after, but it means they will be ultimately well. And those are things that help me. And then one very last thing from her book, Fine Black Lines. She says, I have longed, she calls this maturity. I have longed for certainty. I have cried for truth. I have sought the unimpeachable faith. I have wondered, how would I know if and when I found the answer, whether I had indeed asked the question? Perhaps maturity is knowing there are no answers and finding the courage to live without them. And it's kind of a thing that helps me sometimes, that sometimes there are no answers and we keep moving on. We keep on. I'm going to stop there. They are going to be changing the room around. I'll be here for